The war had a sound, and now it was gone. That was the first wrong thing. The SU-152 assault gun, a 46-ton beast of welded steel and anger, moved through a landscape of profound and deafening silence. Its own noise was a violation. The deafening roar of its V2 diesel engine, the shriek and clatter of its tracks on the frozen, torn earth. It was a solitary animal, separated from its herd. Inside the steel belly, the world was reduced to sensations. The constant, bone-deep vibration. The suffocating smell of hot engine oil, stale sweat, gunpowder residue, and the sharp, tinny scent of fear. Each man was a prisoner in his own small space, connected only by the scratchy intercom and shared dread. Senior Lieutenant Yevgeny Kalinin, commander, saw the world through a narrow periscope. His eyes, a flat, weathered gray, did not blink often. They scanned the ruins of the East Prussian village with a methodical, lifeless rhythm. He was not looking for threats. He was cataloging cover, assessing angles of fire, measuring avenues of escape. His mind was a cold map. But beneath that map, a silent, frantic calculation ran. Fuel levels, ammunition count, the worrying delay since last radio contact. His left hand, resting on the cold metal wall, absently traced the outline of a small, smooth stone in his pocket. A talisman from his daughter, brought from the shores of the Black Sea. A world away. To his right, Gunner Ivan Sokolov's universe, was the rubber eyepiece of the ML-20S howitzer sight. He called it the keyhole to hell. His job was to turn living men and complex machines into simple, solvable problems of range, deflection, and trajectory. But Vanya had a sickness, a secret flaw his comrades did not know. Every target, in the second before he fired, became human. A blur behind a vision block became a face. The silhouette of a tank transformed into the driver's hunched shoulders. To fire, he had to consciously erase the picture his mind painted. He would whisper a single word, a personal exorcism. Steal. It was his ritual. Now, sweeping the dead streets, he saw only empty windows like the sockets of a skull. Behind them, loader Fyodor Petrov, dead, existed in a world of weight and momentum. His kingdom was the cramped space between the stowed 152mm shells. He knew each one by touch, the rough texture of the high explosive fragmentation rounds, the smoother, denser feel of the concrete piercing shells. He was a man of physical absolutes. The war had taken his family, his village, his past. All that remained was the immediate reality of his muscles, the next shell, the next breath. His philosophy was simple. You are alive until the metal stops you. Everything else was sentiment, and sentiment was a luxury that got you killed. He watched the back of Kalinin's head, judging the tension in his shoulders, and chewed on a stale crust of bread, with the grim satisfaction of a man expecting the worst and never being disappointed. Below, in his isolated metal coffin, driver Semyon Glukov conversed with the machine. His hands, encased in grimy gloves, danced on the twin steering levers, not as controls, but as extensions of his will. He felt every rock, every hidden ditch, through the vibration in his palms and the seat of his pants. He was superstitious. He believed the assault gun, Zveroboy, had a soul, a grumpy, ancient, and volatile one. He patted a bulkhead affectionately after a difficult maneuver. He whispered promises of fresh grease and clean fuel filters. He saw omens everywhere. A lone crow flying west was bad. The way the morning frost had cracked on his vision slit in a spider web pattern, that was very bad. Now, navigating this silent corpse of a town, his every instinct screamed. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was predatory. It was the pause before the strike. In the rear, jammed against the radio set, was Arkady Novikov, Ark, the youngest, his face still holding the softness of a boy. This was his baptism. The smells, the noise, the terrifying closeness of the others. It was overwhelming. He clutched the headset to his ear, desperate for the crackle of a familiar voice, for orders, for anything that would anchor him to the larger, organized army they belonged to. He had a photo of his university study group in Moscow, tucked behind the radio's wiring. He imagined himself there, arguing about poetry, not sitting in a moving tomb waiting for death. His fear was a live wire in his chest. Every sudden lurch of the vehicle made his heart stutter. He watched the older men trying to mimic their stillness, their apparent calm, and felt like a fraud in a uniform that was too big for him. They had been left behind. A simple, stupid mechanical flaw, a clogged fuel filter in the freezing night, had turned them into ghosts. Their battalion had moved on, a roaring tide of T-34s and shouting men, leaving them in a void. For 2 hours they had chased, a lone predator trailing the herd. Now they entered the main street of a larger town. The destruction here was more systematic. Buildings were not just damaged, but eviscerated, their interiors exposed like dollhouses. A torn curtain fluttered from a third-story window. A child's bicycle, twisted and frozen, lay half buried in rubble. Kalinin's voice crackled in the intercom, flat and devoid of emotion. He ordered the vehicle to slow. He ordered Vanya to scan the upper windows. He ordered Ark to keep trying the radio. The commands were routine, but their execution was charged with a new electric tension. Syoma, in his driver's compartment, felt the cobblestones through the tracks. Too loud. They were making too much noise. He saw movement, a shadow detaching itself from a deeper shadow in a second-floor window 400 meters ahead. It wasn't a man. It was a suggestion. He opened his mouth to speak. The world ended. There was no warning roar, only a cataclysmic, orange-white detonation that consumed reality. It came from the left, a side street they had just passed. A Ferdinand tank destroyer, a slab of armor the color of mud, had been waiting in perfect ambush, its long 88mm cannon now breathing fire. The shell was not meant for them. It was a mistake, a fraction of a miscalculation by the German gunner. It passed so close to the SU-152's driver's compartment that the heat blistered the paint. It struck the corner of a brick pharmacy behind them. The effect was apocalyptic. The concussion wave hit the Zveroboy like the fist of God. The 30-ton vehicle was lifted and slammed down on its suspension. Inside, the universe became a carousel of pain and blinding light. The emergency lights blew out, plunging them into a darkness lit only by the hellish glow from the vision slits. Unsecured tools became deadly projectiles. A wrench glanced off Dead's helmet with a sickening clang. Ark was thrown forward, his head connecting with the radio set. A bright white pain exploded behind his eyes, and he tasted blood. He did not cry out. The breath was simply knocked from his lungs, replaced by pure animal terror. Vanya's face smashed into the eyepiece of his sight. He felt the cartilage in his nose bend, and a hot gush of blood flooded his mouth. The word "steal" evaporated, replaced by a silent, wordless scream. Dead, braced like a rock, felt a shell in its rack come loose. He lunged, not for his own safety, but to trap the massive projectile with his own body, pinning it against the wall to prevent it from crushing Kalinin. The effort tore at his muscles. Kalinin's head snapped back, his helmet ringing against the steel command cupola. Stars exploded in his vision. His first, primal thought was not of command, but of the smooth stone in his pocket. He felt for it, a point of sanity in the chaos. And Sayoma saw it. In the microsecond after the blast, as the shockwave distorted the air, a jagged spear of brick, propelled by the explosion at hypersonic speed, shot through his narrow, open vision slit. Time did not slow. It became crystalline, horrifyingly clear. He saw the spinning piece of masonry, saw the worn edges, saw the faded red of the clay. There was no time to flinch. It struck him with the force of a sledgehammer, not in the face, but lower, punching through layers of wool, leather, and flesh, burying itself deep in the junction of his left shoulder and chest. The impact was not sharp, but deep and crushing. The air left his lungs not in a scream, but in a soft, wet sigh of utter surprise. A strange quiet descended, broken only by the ringing in their ears and the ominous hiss of escaping steam from the engine. The smell changed. Now it was the acrid stench of shattered masonry, burned explosives, and the coppery, intimate smell of Sayoma's blood, warm and thick in the cold air. Kalinin's training took over. His voice, ragged but clear, tore through the intercom. Driver, reverse, full power, now. From the driver's compartment came a choked, guttural sound of effort. Sayoma, his right world dissolving into a white-hot nova of pain, his left side a numb, heavy dead weight, focused every shred of his being into his right arm. He found the gear lever. He pulled. The engine, miraculously, coughed and roared back to life. The Zveroboy lurched backward, tracks screeching in protest. The Ferdinand, a slow reloader, was momentarily blinded by its own shot and the dust cloud. It did not fire again. Kalinin's eyes, streaming from dust and concussion, swept his periscope. An opening. A narrow, dark alley between two bombed-out textile warehouses. It was a desperate, terrible option. Turn. Hard right. Now. Sayoma obeyed. With a groan that was part machine, part man, he wrenched the right steering lever back. The assault gun pivoted violently, its flank grinding against the brickwork of the alley entrance, showering sparks and debris inside the compartment. It plunged into the narrow passage, into near-total darkness. They were safe from the Ferdinand. But the alley was a tunnel of debris. Sayoma, fighting a black wave of unconsciousness, drove by instinct alone. The Zveroboy crunched over fallen beams, pushed aside piles of rubble. For 10 seconds, there was hope. Then the right track, already stressed from the violent turn and damaged by the shock wave of the near miss, met its end. It slammed down into a deep, water-filled shell crater, perfectly concealed by shadow and wreckage. There was a final, sickening sound, the loud metallic snap of a broken torsion bar. The vehicle jarred to a violent halt, listing sharply to starboard. The engine sputtered and died. The silence returned, but now it was inside the machine as well as outside. It was a thick, heavy silence, broken only by the ping of cooling metal, the drip of melting snow from the hull, and the ragged, wet, and terribly weak sound of Semyon Glukov trying to breathe. The darkness in the compartment was absolute. No one spoke. The shock was too complete. They were no longer ghosts trailing an army. They were ghosts in a steel tomb, buried alive. And the only sound from the outside world was the distant, grinding squeal of the Ferdinand's tracks, turning, beginning a slow, methodical hunt to find the entrance to their alley. The silence after the engine's death was not empty. It was a physical substance, thick and cloying, pressing in on them from the dark. It was filled with the intimate, terrible sounds of their new reality. The slow, rhythmic drip-drip of engine coolant hitting pooled oil. The sharp, irregular intake of breath from 5 pairs of lungs, each breathing a private terror. And underneath it all, the wet, bubbling rasp from the driver's compartment, a sound that was less breathing and more a drowning man's struggle for air. Arkady Novikov was the first to break. The pain in his head was a bright, shrieking siren. The taste of his own blood was a child's nightmare of broken teeth and helplessness. He fumbled in the blackness, hands scrabbling against cold, unyielding metal, slick with unknown fluids. A sob hitched in his throat, a pathetic, helpless sound that he tried to swallow and couldn't. His mind screamed for the orderly world of maps and radio codes, for the distant voice of a battalion commander. He found the headset, dangling. He pressed it to his ear, his other hand frantically turning the dial on the radio set, his fingers slipping on the knobs. He heard nothing, not even static, a dead, hollow void. The final tether had snapped. The sob escaped, a sharp, ugly gasp in the dark. Quiet. The word from Kalinin was not a shout. It was a low, cold crack, like ice splitting underfoot. It cut through Ark's panic more effectively than a slap. The boy froze, his breath held, tears of pain and shame mixing with the blood on his face. Light. They needed light. Kalinin's hands moved by memory, fumbling in a compartment by his knee. His fingers closed around the cold, cylindrical shape of a German flashlight, a battlefield trophy. He clicked the switch. A weak, yellow beam pierced the gloom, illuminating swirling motes of dust, oil smoke, and the stunned faces of his crew. The beam found Vanya first. The gunner was slumped against his sight, blood from his broken nose, a dark mask over his lower face. His eyes were wide, unseeing, locked on some internal horror, the phantom faces he hadn't needed to erase. The beam moved to dead. The loader was already moving, his face a grim mask of practicality. He had braced the loose shell, and now he was pulling a first aid kit from its clamps with brute, deliberate force. Then the light swept to the driver's station. The sight was visceral, grotesque. Semyon Glukov was pinned in his seat, like a specimen. The shard of brick was not a neat knife blade. It was a crude, brutal wedge, as thick as a man's wrist at its base, tapering to a ragged point now buried deep in the meat of his shoulder. His padded winter jacket was dark and sodden, a deep maroon spreading outward. His face was the color of old paper, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing air now leaking into the hull. His eyes were open, glazed with shock, but they found Kalinin's light. His lips moved, forming no words, only a silent, agonized exhalation. Dead did not wait for orders. He shoved past Kalinin, his bulk filling the narrow space. He didn't speak to Syoma with platitudes. He spoke to the wound. "Don't you dare move, you superstitious fool," he grumbled, his voice a gravelly anchor in the chaos. He tore open the first aid kit, pulling out a thick packet of gauze. With hands that could wrestle 100-pound shells, he began to pack the horrific wound, applying pressure around the embedded object, not on it. Syoma whimpered, a low animal sound, his head lolling back. Kalinin's mind, the cold map, was redrawing itself at a furious pace. Survival was a sequence of problems. First problem, the crew. He barked orders, his voice regaining its metallic edge. "Novikov, status report on all systems. Now, use your light. Sokolov, clear your sight. Assess external damage on your side. Dead. Stabilize him. Then check the ammunition. Ark jumped at his name. The order's a lifeline. He fumbled for his own flashlight, his hands trembling so badly the beam danced wildly over the gauges. He reported in a shaky monotone. Fuel, half. Electrical, intermittent. Radio, dead. Engine, catastrophic seizure suspected. Vanya mechanically wiped the blood from his face with a dirty sleeve, smearing it into a grotesque war paint. He peered through his vision block, his good eye scanning the alley. He reported the world outside. A narrow canyon of crumbling brick walls, barely wider than their hull. The right track was deep in a crater. The rear was blocked by the rubble they had pushed in. The front, maybe 6 meters ahead, opened onto a slightly wider space, a crossroads of sorts between the back walls of warehouses. Kalinin processed it, trapped, immobilized. The Ferdinand was out there, hunting. They were a wounded animal in a thicket. Second problem, position. A stationary assault gun was a coffin. But a coffin could be a fortress. He needed to see. "I'm going out," he announced. The statement hung in the foul air. Going out meant opening the heavy rear hatch, breaking the seal of their metal womb, exposing them to the silent, waiting town. No one objected. Dead merely grunted, not looking up from his work on Syoma, whose breathing seemed to be growing shallower, more rapid. Kalinin chambered a round in his TT-33 pistol, the click unnaturally loud. He nodded to Ark, who, with a trembling hand, undogged the heavy hatch lock. A blast of freezing air, smelling of snow, soot, and decay, rushed in. It was shockingly clean compared to the metallic stink inside. Kalinin pushed the hatch open just enough to slide out, dropping into the rubble-strewn alley. The cold was a physical blow. He crouched, pistol raised, scanning the high walls. No movement. Only the whisper of the wind through broken glass. He moved forward, his boots crunching on frost and debris. The Zveroboy was a beached leviathan, listing grievously. He saw the broken torsion arm, a clean metallic break. No field repair. Ever. He reached the front of the vehicle. The alley opened into a small, rectangular yard formed by the backs of 4 large buildings. In the center was a cobblestone crossroads. To the left and right, the gaps between buildings were too narrow for a tank. But straight ahead, a wider lane, perhaps once a service road, led south. It was the only viable route for an armored vehicle. And it was empty. For now. This crossroads was a killing zone. But for whom? His eyes, the commander's eyes, analyzed the geometry. The Zveroboy, stuck at the mouth of the alley, had a clear field of fire straight down the service road for nearly 300 meters. Its thick frontal armor was facing the most likely direction of attack. The buildings on either side of the yard offered some flank protection. It was a defensible position. A terrible, desperate position, but defensible. A fortress. A stone coffin with a single massive cannon pointing out. He heard a low groan from inside the tank, Sioma's voice, weak but desperate. "Not here, Commander. Bad place. The shadows. They're gathering." Kalinin ignored the superstition, but a chill that had nothing to do with the air traced his spine. He looked up at the windows of the surrounding buildings. Dark, empty, watching. A new sound cut the stillness. Not from the town, from the east. The distant, faint, but unmistakable rumble of diesel engines. Many of them. A deep, throaty growl, different from the high-pitched scream of the Ferdinand. It was the sound of German Panther tanks moving in formation. The calculation in Kalinin's mind completed itself with cold, brutal logic. The Ferdinand was a hunter. The Panthers were a spearhead. They were cutting across country, likely trying to flank the advancing Soviet lines. This service road, this crossroads, was a perfect, undefended artery for them. They were not just trapped. They were sitting directly in the path of an armored column. He turned and looked back at the Zveroboy. In the weak light from the open hatch, he saw Vanya's pale, blood-streaked face staring out at him. The young gunner's eyes were no longer glazed. They were focused, asking the silent question. Kalinin did not nod. He did not gesture. He simply held the gunner's gaze for a long, cold second. The map was drawn. The problem was defined. They were no longer a crew trying to rejoin their unit. They were an obstacle, a piece of terrain to be held. He climbed back into the stinking, painful warmth of the hull, pulling the hatch shut behind him with a final, resonant clang. The coffin was sealed. He looked at his crew, the bleeding boy, the dying driver, the terrified loader's assistant, the cynical veteran, and the gunner who saw faces. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, stripped of all emotion, all pretense. It was the sound of a man reading a death sentence, not to them, but to the enemy that did not yet know they were here. We are not leaving. We are fortifying. They are coming down that road. We will be the wall. The commander's words hung in the fetid air, not as a declaration of heroism, but as a grim statement of thermodynamic fact. A wall does not choose to be a wall. It simply is. For a moment, the only sound was Syoma's ragged, wet breathing, a metronome counting down their diminishing odds. Then Dead moved. He finished tying off a crude, blood-soaked bandage around the brick shard in Syoma's shoulder, a temporary dam against the inevitable. He did not look at Kalinin. He looked at the ammunition racks. His kingdom. He began a silent inventory, his thick fingers touching each massive shell with the reverence of a priest counting sacred relics. His face was a stone carving of disdain, but his movements were fluid, efficient. This was a language he understood. Scarcity, weight, kill probability. Arkady Novikov felt the commander's statement not as an order, but as a physical collapse of the world. The last flickering hope of escape, of reunion, guttered and died. The cold metal around him ceased to be a vehicle and became his tomb. His stomach clenched. He scrambled for the rear hatch, a primal urge for open air, for any alternative to this sealed fate. His fingers clawed at the latch. "Sit down, boy." Dead's voice was a low growl, not even looking up from a concrete piercing round. "You open that. You let the cold in. He dies faster." He jerked his head toward Syoma. "And you show the whole street where the meat is. You want to die useful, or just die?" Ark froze, his hands trembling on the cold metal. The logic was a cage. He slumped back, the taste of blood and vomit in his throat, his eyes wide and unseeing. Vanya Sokolov, in contrast, underwent a terrifying transformation. The panic, the shock, the bleeding nose, it all receded, burned away by a cold, focused flame. Kalinin's words had given the chaos a purpose, a vector. He wiped his face clean with a brutal swipe of his sleeve, ignoring the fresh smear of blood. His world narrowed to the optics of his sight. He traversed the massive gun left, then right, measuring the field of fire. He noted the crumbling corner of a warehouse at 200 meters that would mask an approaching tank's hull until the last second. He marked a pile of rubble at 150 that could be a firing position for German infantry. His mind, trained for this, began running calculations automatically. Windage, negligible in the canyon. Target speed, estimate 30 kilometers per hour for a Panther in an urban advance. His lips moved silently, not in prayer, but in the sacred geometry of destruction. Kalinin saw the shift in his crew. The paralyzing shock was crystallizing into something harder, sharper. He began issuing commands, each one a brick in their makeshift fortress. Novikov, you are now our eyes and ears. You will take Sioma's PPSH and all our grenades. You will go out there. He pointed through the vision slit toward the crossroads. You will find a position in that building. He indicated a 3-story warehouse with blown-out windows overlooking the service road. You will watch that road. You will listen. You will not fire unless infantry are at our hull. Your job is to warn us, to see them before they see us. Ark stared, a new terror replacing the old. Alone. Outside the steel womb. He opened his mouth to protest, but Kalinin's eyes were already elsewhere. Sokolov, you have the gun. The first shot is everything. We will have one surprise. You will wait until you see the commander's cupola. You will put a shell through its base. Not the turret. The hull, where it meets the turret ring. You will not miss. Vanya nodded once, his eye already glued back to the sight, his hands resting lightly on the elevation and traverse wheels. The word steel formed on his bloody lips, a silent mantra. Dead. Prepare 2 loads. First, armor-piercing concrete. Second, high explosive fragmentation. We break its armor, then we kill its crew if it stays alive. Dead grunted in affirmation. He pulled the 2 designated shells from the racks, placing them with deliberate, heavy thuds on the ready rack by the breech. The metallic clangs were vows of violence. And me? The voice was a thin, pained whisper from the driver's seat. Sioma's eyes were glazed but lucid. He was drowning in pain, but the thought of being useless was worse. Kalinin looked at his driver, the man who talked to machines. You are the keeper of the house, Sioma. You watch our backs. You listen to the metal. You tell me if you hear tracks from the alleys behind us. You are our rear guard. A ghost of a smile touched Sioma's ashen lips. A purpose. He nodded weakly, his good hand fumbling for a pistol grip on the hull-mounted machine gun he could no longer physically operate, but could still monitor. Then Kalinin did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, smooth black stone from the Black Sea. He held it for a moment in his palm, feeling its impossible coolness, its connection to a world of sun and salt and a daughter's laugh. Then, without ceremony, he placed it on a small ledge next to Sioma's station. For luck, he said, his voice devoid of sentiment. It was not a gift. It was a transfer of responsibility. He was shedding his last link to the man he was before this crossroads, becoming pure function. He turned to Ark. Now go. Ark moved like an automaton. He slung the heavy submachine gun over his shoulder, stuffed his pockets with F1 grenades, their serrated casings cold and ominous. With a last, terrified glance at the dim interior, at Dead's stony back, at Vanya's terrifying focus, at Sioma's dying vigil, he pushed open the rear hatch and spilled out into the freezing yard. The cold was a shock, cleansing and brutal. He scrambled on hands and knees across the open cobblestones, expecting a sniper's bullet with every heartbeat. He reached the shadow of the warehouse wall, his breath coming in ragged, steaming plumes. He found a shattered doorway and slipped inside. The interior was a cathedral of decay. Frozen shafts of gray light pierced holes in the roof, illuminating swirling dust, and the carcasses of dead machinery. The silence here was even deeper, a listening silence. Every creak of a beam, every skitter of a rat was a potential enemy. He climbed a skeletal staircase, his boots crunching on broken plaster, until he reached a second-floor window with a good view of the service road. He crouched, making himself small, and looked out. The Zveroboy looked pathetic from here, a wounded beast stuck in a trap, its mighty gun pointed impotently down the empty lane. The crossroads was a stage. He was the hidden audience, waiting for the play to begin. Back inside the assault gun, time distended. Minutes felt like hours. The only sounds were the labored breathing from the driver's seat and the soft, metallic clicks as Vanya made infinitesimal adjustments to his sight. Dead stood like a statue by the breach, one hand resting on the waiting, armor-piercing shell, his eyes closed, conserving energy, listening to the world through the steel hull. Kalinin peered through his periscope, sweeping the service road. The distant rumble of the Panthers had faded, absorbed by the urban maze. Were they coming? Had they turned? The doubt was an acid in his veins. Had he just condemned them to die in silence for nothing? Then a new sound. Not engines. A soft, scraping crunch from the right-side alley. The one too narrow for a tank. Everyone inside heard it. Sioma's eyes snapped open. Footsteps, he breathed, the word a bloody bubble. 3, maybe 4. Kalinin's blood ran cold. Infantry. A reconnaissance patrol. They would find the Zveroboy. They would call in the Ferdinand, or worse, circle behind, and plant a magnetic mine. He looked at Dead. The loader's eyes were open now, cold and hard. He had heard. He slowly, silently drew his own pistol. Vanya's hands tightened on the controls, but he did not move the massive gun. It was useless in this fight. They waited, trapped in their metal coffin, listening to death approach on soft-soled boots. Ark, from his perch, saw them first. 4 German soldiers in winter camouflage, moving cautiously, their rifles at the ready. They were not looking at the warehouse. They were edging toward the alley where the Zveroboy was hidden. In moments they would stumble right into the open yard, right into point-blank view of Ark's position and of the assault gun's blind side. Ark's heart hammered against his ribs. The PPSH felt alien in his hands. Kalinin's order echoed, "You will not fire unless infantry are at our hull." They weren't at the hull yet, but they would be. He had seconds. The calculus of survival was now his. He saw the lead German, a young man with a sharp face, pause and look directly toward the Zveroboy's alley. He raised a hand, signaling a halt. He was about to investigate. Ark's finger found the cold curve of the trigger. He had never fired at a man. The faces from his university photo flickered in his mind. He swallowed, the taste of his own blood still in his mouth. He saw the German soldier take a careful step forward. He closed his eyes and squeezed the trigger. The submachine gun in Arkady Novikov's hands did not so much fire as erupt. It was a living, furious creature, bucking and screaming in a staccato roar that tore apart the sacred, listening silence of the warehouse. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, holding the trigger down in a white-knuckled grip of pure terror, the muzzle climbing wildly, stitching a jagged line of splinters and dust up the wall opposite the window. When the magazine emptied with a final deafening click, the silence that rushed back in was a physical weight. It was broken by a single sharp cry of pain from outside, not a scream, but a shocked, guttural yell. Ark's eyes flew open. Smoke coiled from the hot barrel, acrid in the freezing air. Below, in the courtyard, chaos frozen in a snapshot. The lead German soldier was on his knees, clutching his thigh, dark blood welling through the white camouflage smock. The other three were not dead. They were not even hit. They were prone, flattened against the cobblestones and rubble, their faces turned toward his window, with expressions of pure, predatory shock. They had been surprised, not eliminated. And now they knew exactly where he was. From his position, Ark saw the wounded man shout something, pointing a frantic hand toward his window. One of the others immediately raised his rifle. A muzzle flash, tiny and silent from this distance, preceded the crack of the shot and the shriek of a bullet tearing through the wood and plaster inches from Ark's head. Plaster dust snowed down on him. He had done everything wrong. He had revealed their position. He had wasted ammunition. He had wounded a man, condemning him to a slow, painful death in the cold, and in doing so, had turned a stealthy patrol into an alerted, angry enemy. The wave of nausea that hit him was so profound he almost vomited over the windowsill. Inside the Zveroboy, the burst of gunfire was a thunderclap of confirmation. Kalinin's jaw tightened. The boy had fired. The situation had escalated. He saw through his periscope the Germans scrambling for cover in the yard, their attention now split between the ominous alley mouth hiding his vehicle and the warehouse window. "Novikov has engaged infantry," Kalinin stated, his voice a flat line. "They are in the open. They will call in armor or flank us." Dead's face was a mask of contempt. The fool. He's painted a target on his back in ours. Yet even as he spoke, he was moving. He slammed shut the heavy breech of the ML-20S gun, the final metallic clang a period to their waiting. The beast was ready to bite. But it could not bite ants. Vanya's eye never left his sight, his focus still laser-locked on the empty service road. The true threat. But a muscle in his cheek twitched. The sound of the firefight was a distraction he could not afford. He repeated his silent word. Steel. 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 It was Semyon Glukov, from his pool of pain and shadows, who spoke next, his voice a threadbare whisper. The small door, behind the boiler house, near the boy's feet. It leads to the cellar. The shadows there. They are deep. They are moving. Kalinin didn't question it. Syoma's omens were their only intelligence now. He keyed the intercom, knowing Ark could not hear him, but hoping the boy was looking, thinking. Down in the yard, the Germans were reorganizing. Two were laying down, suppressing fire on Ark's window, the bullets chewing the frame to splinters, forcing him to curl into a ball, useless. The third, ignoring his wounded comrade who was now dragging himself toward cover, began moving in a low crouch toward the very alley where the Zveroboy lay hidden. He carried not a rifle, but a long, ominous tube, a Panzerfaust. Kalinin saw it. The man was 30 meters away, then 20, finding cover behind a pile of broken masonry, lining up his shot on the exposed flank of the stationary assault gun. At this range, even the Zveroboy's side armor would not save it. Kalinin made a decision. A brutal trade. He traversed the turret. Not the main gun, but the hull-mounted 7.62 mm T machine gun, operated by a mechanical linkage from his position. He squeezed the trigger. The machine gun's rattle was a harsh, mechanical rip after the bark of rifles. Tracer rounds streaked across the yard, sparking off the cobblestones, walking toward the German with the Panzerfaust. The soldier flinched, ducking back behind his cover. He was pinned, but not dead. And now Kalinin had revealed their exact position and defensive capability. Above, Ark heard the machine gun, saw the tracers. He saw the wounded German, now alone and moaning behind a low wall. He saw the Panzerfaust gunner, trapped but alive. The two others were still firing at him. He was a liability. Kalinin's words echoed, "You will not fire unless infantry are at our hull." The man with the Panzerfaust was at their hull. A strange calm descended on Ark. The blind panic was gone, burned away by the searing shame of his failure. He fumbled with a fresh magazine, his hands steadier now. He was not fighting for glory or for the motherland. He was fighting to correct a mistake, to be less of a burden. He did not spray fire. He took a single, shuddering breath, exhaled half of it, and aimed at the corner of masonry, where the Panzerfaust gunner was hiding. He waited. A helmeted head peered out for a split second to assess. Ark squeezed off a short, 3-round burst. Chips of stone exploded. The head ducked back. He had bought seconds. He looked at the wounded man. The soldier had stopped moving. His eyes were open, staring at the gray sky. He was alive, watching his own blood seep into the snow. Ark felt no hatred, only a hollow, terrible pity. This was the calculus. A wounded man could still shout, could still guide others. He was a node of information. Ark adjusted his aim. His finger rested on the trigger. He thought of the faces in his photo, smiling, oblivious. He thought of Syoma's wet breathing. He thought of the smooth black stone from the Black Sea. He did not close his eyes this time. The single shot was lost in the sporadic gunfire. The wounded soldier's head jerked slightly, then lay still. The staring ceased. Ark did not feel remorse. He felt empty. A vessel now filled with a new, cold substance, necessity. He had passed through a door and closed it behind him. He was no longer a boy from Moscow. He was the guardian of the flank, and he had just paid his entry fee in a currency of pure horror. Below, the machine gun fire had stopped. The sudden quiet was tense, pregnant. The two remaining Germans, realizing their sniper was not suppressing them anymore, made a decision. They broke cover, not advancing but retreating, dragging their now dead comrade with them, vanishing into the maze of rubble from whence they came. They had the information they needed: a fortified position, an assault gun, a sniper. They would report. The immediate threat was over. The yard was empty again, save for the new, dark stain on the snow. Inside the Zveroboy, Kalinin processed the silence. He had seen the final shot from the warehouse. He understood what it meant. The boy had learned. The cost of the lesson was now a part of the geometry of the crossroads. "Novikov has stabilized his position," Kalinin said, the first hint of grim approval in his tone. "He bought us time." Ded merely grunted, unimpressed but acknowledging the result. "Time we use. They're coming. I can smell it." Vanya, still fixed on his sight, finally spoke, his voice dry and cracked. "I see dust on the service road, at the limit of my vision. The wind is not blowing." Everyone understood. Dust meant movement. Heavy movement. Syoma, his voice weaker, whispered again. "The cellar, the shadows. They are not German shadows." Kalinin ignored the delirium. He issued new orders, his mind racing ahead of the approaching storm. "Dead. Prepare the high-explosive shell after the first. We may need to bring a building down on them. Sokolov, the first target is the lead tank. Nothing else exists. Novikov will have to handle the rest." He looked at the periscope, at the empty, deadly lane. The skirmish was over. It had been a bloody, clumsy prelude, a baptism. The real battle, the one they were designed for, the one that would crack the sky and shake the earth, was now rolling toward them down a frozen service road, wrapped in the grinding squeal of tank tracks and the cold promise of obliteration. They had shed their weaknesses one by one. Now only the steel remained. The dust Vanya saw was not an illusion. It was a premonition made solid, a low, drifting haze creeping above the cobblestones of the service road, stirred by no wind. Inside the Zveroboy, the world condensed into a single narrow tunnel, the optics of the gunner's sight. Vanya's universe was a circle of magnified gray, framed by etched reticles. He had stopped breathing. His heartbeat was a distant, irrelevant thud. The only thing that existed was the empty point where the road vanished behind a half-collapsed bakery, 300 meters away. The sounds from the yard faded. Ark's gunfire, the moans of the wind, Sioma's labored breathing, all were pushed into a muffled background. For Vanya, there was only the waiting silence and the cold calculation in his mind. Lead angle, estimated 30 kilometers per hour. Turret ring, not the mantlet. The ring. Dead stood like a monolith beside the breach, one massive hand resting on the ready rack. Fingers splayed over the concrete-piercing shell's ogive. His other hand held the next shell, the high explosive, braced against his hip. His face was impassive, but the tendons in his neck stood out like cables. He was a coiled spring of potential violence, a machine part awaiting its function. Kalinin, at his periscope, saw more. He saw the way the dust cloud behaved, thickening, rising. Not one vehicle, several. The deep, guttural snarl of Maybach engines began as a vibration in the ground, transmitted up through the Zveroboy's hull, a feeling before a sound. Then it reached their ears. A low, rolling thunder growing in volume, a sound of inexorable, mechanical purpose. Sioma heard it too. His good hand fluttered, landing on the smooth black stone Kalinin had given him. His lips moved, whispering not to God, but to the machine. "Steady, my beauty. Steady. They come to test you. Show them your teeth." His eyes were closed, but he was seeing the tanks in his mind, a driver's intuition painting their approach from the tremors in the earth. Ark, from his perch, saw them first as shapes in the dust. Angular, predatory shadows resolving from the gloom. Not the boxy silhouette of a Panzer IV, but the sloping, sleek, and deadly form of a Panther. Its long, overhanging 75mm gun swung like a predator's snout, probing the air. Then another behind it, and another. A column. His mouth went dry. He counted 4, but the dust promised more. He wanted to scream a warning into the silent radio, but there was no need. The roar of their engines was warning enough. The lead Panther emerged fully into the open stretch of road. It moved with a confident, rolling gait, its commander visible in the cupola, binoculars raised, scanning the buildings ahead, but not yet seeing the steel maw waiting in the shadow of the alley at the crossroads. It was a perfect, monstrous picture of power. Inside the Zveroboy, Vanya's sight was filled with the flank of the beast. He saw the commander's torso, the crisp black of his uniform, the way he turned to shout something down into the hull. He saw the Shoberzen, the side skirts, the road wheels. His mind did not see a man. It saw a complex of angles and armor values. His crosshairs settled not on the turret, but lower, just behind the front drive sprocket, where the slightly thinner side armor met the belly of the beast. A shot to cripple, to immobilize, to make it a roadblock for the others. Kalinin's voice was a whisper in the intercom, a final thread of control. Wait. Let him commit. Let him pass the rubble pile. The Panther advanced, unsuspecting. 70 meters. Now 50. It was beginning to turn its hull slightly, presenting a better angle to proceed through the crossroads. Fire. The word was a trigger for the apocalypse. Vanya's world exploded in sound and fury. He did not pull a trigger. He completed an equation. His foot stomped on the firing pedal. The discharge of the 152mm howitzer gun inside the confines of the steel hull was not a sound. It was a physical annihilation of air, a colossal, deafening crump whoosh that felt like a giant's fist smashing into the chest of every man inside. The breech slammed back in a cloud of acrid smoke and fiery gases. The entire 46-ton vehicle lurched backward in its crater, metal screaming in protest. For a split second, Vanya was blind, deaf, and numb. The optics went dark with smoke. Then, as the smoke cleared, he saw the result. The shell, a massive lump of hardened steel and explosive, had not missed. It had not even just hit. It had arrived. It struck the Panther precisely where Vanya had aimed. But the physics were beyond comprehension. The Panther did not explode in a Hollywood fireball. It underwent a violent, mechanistic seizure. The impact point vanished in a flash of sparks and molten metal. The entire side of the tank seemed to cave inwards violently. Every external tool, every storage box, was shredded and hurled into the air. The left side track was not broken. It was vaporized along with 3 road wheels, which flew off like grotesque metal coins. The tank slewed violently to the left, its snout digging into the cobblestones, throwing up a wave of stone and dirt. A jet of dark smoke, then a lick of flame, erupted from the ruptured engine compartment. The commander, who had been standing, simply disappeared, vaporized or torn to pieces by the shockwave and shrapnel. The Panther was dead. A smoldering, immobilized hulk, perfectly blocking the center of the service road. The silence that followed was relative. A ringing, high-pitched tinnitus filled their ears, muffling the outside world. But they saw the chaos. The second Panther, following too close, slammed to a halt, its front almost nudging the wreck of its leader. For 3 precious seconds it was stationary, shocked. Kalinin was already screaming. "Reload! The second tank! Now!" Dead was already in motion. The drill was sacred. The smoking, spent casing was ejected, clanging hotly into the brass catcher. He moved with a ballet of brute force, hefting the high-explosive shell, slamming it into the breech, closing it with a decisive, final clang. Up! Vanya, his nose bleeding again from the concussion, shook his head to clear the stars. He traversed the gun left, the motors whining. He saw the second Panther beginning to reverse, its commander frantically trying to back away from the trap. He didn't aim for the armor. He aimed for the cobblestones directly under its front hull. Fire! The second roar was a twin of the first, another massive blow to their senses. The high-explosive shell struck the ground and detonated in a geyser of stone, dirt, and black smoke. The Panther was enveloped. When the smoke cleared, it was still intact, but listing, one track clearly damaged. More importantly, it was blind and panicked, reversing erratically into the third tank, now trying to maneuver around the growing chaos. The crossroads was becoming a clogged artery. But the Germans were not rookies. The third and fourth Panthers, further back, had stopped. Their commanders had grasped the situation. They weren't facing a hidden anti-tank gun. They were facing a stationary, powerful assault gun in a fortified position. They began to back up, seeking cover, not to flee, but to redeploy. to bring their superior numbers and mobility to bear, to flank. And then, a new, sharper sound joined the deep growl of the Panthers. A higher-pitched, rhythmic "Brrrt" from the right. Tracer rounds, green and alien, streaked across the yard, sparking off the Zveroboy's frontal armor with a sound like a mad drummer on a steel roof. A German ZKF's 251 half-track with a 20mm autocannon had appeared from a side street, supporting the tanks. Its rapid-fire shells couldn't penetrate, but they could blind, they could harass, they could shred the machine gun mounts and periscopes. The Zveroboy was no longer a hidden predator. It was a cornered beast, and the pack was circling, probing, starting to tear at it from a distance. The first perfect blow had been struck. But the fight for the crossroads had just truly begun, and the beast had revealed its position to the entire pack. Now came the slow, systematic hunt. The world dissolved into a cacophony of specific, piercing threats. The triumphant roar of their gun was replaced by the insectile, maddening hammer of the 20mm autocannon. Green tracer fire stitched a relentless, dazzling line across the Zveroboy's frontal plate, each impact a bright flash and a deafening spang-clang that resonated through the hull like a bell tolling doom. Sparks and shards of metal filled the air inside. A fragment ricocheted off the gun sight, leaving a deep scratch across the glass an inch from Vanya's eye. Kalinin flinched as his primary periscope exploded in a shower of optical glass. Leaving him with a fractured, useless view, he cursed, ducking down, relying now on the smaller, less effective vision blocks. They were being blinded, systematically. Ark saw the half-track from his warehouse window. It was positioned behind a low wall, only its cannon and commander visible. It was methodically hosing down the assault gun, its fire unchallenged. He raised his PPSH, then lowered it. The range was too great, the target too small. He was useless. The feeling of impotence was a sour burn in his throat. He scanned the other buildings, the alleys. Movement. German infantry, perhaps a dozen, were dismounting from the rear of the half-track and a supporting truck, scattering into the ruins on either side of the service road. They were not attacking. They were infesting. They would become eyes, guides for the remaining Panthers. Inside the steel coffin, the atmosphere changed from focused violence to claustrophobic siege. The air grew thick with the smell of cordite, hot metal, and a new, more terrifying scent. The ozone-tinged smell of electrical short circuits. Wires, severed by the 20mm fire, sparked and danced behind control panels. Dead, ignoring the fireworks around him, was assessing their stock. 2 armor-piercing shells left, 3 high explosive. The economy of their existence had just become desperately simple. Sioma's voice rose, thin and strained against the noise. Behind, the left alley. Heavy tracks. Not Panther. Heavier. Slower. His hand, pale and trembling, pointed weakly toward the rear of the vehicle. The Ferdinand. The original hunter had caught the scent of the battle and was moving in to finish the wounded prey it had started. Kalinin's mind, the cold map, was now a map of closing walls. Front. Damaged Panthers regrouping, infantry infiltrating. Flank. Autocannon half-track blinding them. Rear. The Ferdinand approaching. They were in a perfect, brutal vice. A new sound joined the symphony. The sharp, high crack of rifle fire and the deeper thump of a machine gun, not aimed at them, aimed at the warehouse. The German infantry had spotted Ark's position and were now pinning him down. Chips of brick and plaster exploded around his window. He ducked, crawling away from the opening. He was no longer an observer. He was a target, isolated and cut off from the Zveroboy. Vanya, his world reduced to the scratched circle of his sight, traversed the gun left, ignoring the autocannon fire. He had to find the half-track. It was the immediate threat. He found it, a blurred shape behind the wall, a difficult shot for a low-velocity howitzer. He needed a direct hit. He loaded the high-explosive shell Dead handed him, his movements now automatic, driven by a primal need to silence the noise. Before he could fire, a much larger impact rocked the Zveroboy, a sound like a cathedral bell being struck with a sledgehammer. The entire vehicle groaned. A plume of dust and smoke erupted from the rear left quarter. The Ferdinand had arrived. It had taken a long-range shot from over 200 meters down the narrow alley behind them. Its 88mm shell, fired from a high-velocity, flat-trajectory gun, was a different kind of hell than their own. It didn't crater. It pierced. The shell had struck the Zveroboy's rear engine deck, angled and thick, but the force was monstrous. Engine coolant lines ruptured, spraying a mist of toxic, sweet-smelling liquid. A fire erupted in the engine compartment. Red warning lights, previously dark, now flickered to life on Ark's abandoned panel. "Engine fire!" Kalinin yelled. "Dead! Extinguisher!" Dead dropped the shell he was holding, the heavy round thudding dangerously on the floor. He wrenched a fire extinguisher from its bracket and began battling the flames licking through the rear bulkhead, his face lit by the hellish glow, his silhouette a demon fighting a contained inferno. The Zveroboy was wounded. It was bleeding fluids and burning. Its power was fading. From his position, Ark saw the Ferdinand. It was a monstrous, slab-sided thing, immobile at the end of the alley like a patient toad. It fired again. Another horrific, clang shriek of metal on metal. This shot hit the rear sprocket, shearing teeth off the track. They were now truly, utterly immobile, not just stuck, crippled. Despair, thick and oily, began to seep into the hull. It was in the frantic hiss of the extinguisher, in the way Vanya's hand shook as he tried to aim, in the hollow, resigned look in Sioma's eyes as he watched Dead fight the fire. Then Sioma spoke. His voice was clear, sudden, devoid of pain. He was looking past them, at the sealed rear hatch, as if seeing through the steel. "The cellar, under the warehouse. The people are afraid. The little one, she is crying." His words cut through the noise. They weren't the ramblings of a dying man. They were a report, a detail from the world outside their metal hell that had breached the hull. Kalinin stared at him. People. Civilians. In the cellar of the warehouse Ark was in, a complication, a burden, a thread of humanity in the geometric problem of death. A burst of machine gun fire from the German infantry chewed across the warehouse windows, specifically targeting the cellar-level openings. They weren't just suppressing Ark. They were probing, perhaps aware of the cellar's existence, perhaps trying to flush out anyone inside. Ark heard it too, the distinct muffled sound of a child's cry, swallowed by a hushing sob, coming from somewhere deep in the bowels of the ruined building beneath him. It was a sound so alien, so utterly out of place in this world of screaming metal and gunpowder, that it froze him. It was a sound from the planet he had left behind. His eyes met Kalinin's across the deadly expanse of the crossroads. The commander, peering through a cracked vision block, gave a single, slow, deliberate shake of his head. The order was clear. The mission. The tanks. Nothing else. But the calculus had changed. The child's cry was a variable Syoma had introduced. A variable that, for Ark, carried the weight of the soul he had just sold with the shot that killed the wounded German. Protecting a hidden, crying child was not in the tactical manual. But it was the line between being a soldier in a tomb and a monster in one. The Ferdinand fired again. The shot went high, smashing into the building above them, raining brick and timber onto the Zveroboy's roof. The beast was zeroing in. They were burning, blind, surrounded, and pinned. And now they were haunted by the sound of a crying child in the dark, a sound that made the value of the ground they held and the price they were paying for it. Suddenly, terribly ambiguous, the cry of the child was a fissure in the armor of their purpose. For a second, the roar of the fire, the hammering of the autocannon, the sporadic rifle fire, all seemed to recede behind that single human sound. It was a crack through which the world before the war poured in, a world of softness and vulnerability that had no place in the steel and calculus of the crossroads. Arkady Novikov, pressed against the grimy warehouse floor, felt the sound in his teeth. It wasn't a strategic problem. It was a hook in his chest, pulling him away from the soldier he was trying to become. He saw, in his mind's eye, the photo of his study group, their smiles now seeming like artifacts from a lost civilization. He saw the face of the German soldier he had killed, the staring eyes. The child's cry connected these fragments into a terrible whole. This was what they were grinding into dust. He made a decision, not as a soldier, but as the ghost of the boy from Moscow. He began to crawl, not toward a better firing position, but away from the window, toward the rear of the warehouse floor, toward the source of the sound. He ignored the bullets snapping through the air above him. His mission, as defined by Kalinin, was over. A new one, defined by that cry, had begun. Inside the Zveroboy, the fissure manifested differently. Semyon Glukov's revelation hung in the smoky air, a moral grenade with the pin pulled. Kalinin's face was a mask of stone, but his eyes, reflected in the cracked glass of a vision block, showed a flicker of something like agony. The commander's calculus had no variable for child in cellar. It was an error, a catastrophic distraction. He forced it out. The map had to remain clean. "Vanya, the half-track, now before it moves." His voice was a ragged snarl, fighting to reclaim the narrative of pure combat. Vanya Sokolov tried. He blinked, trying to force the crosshairs onto the flickering shape behind the wall. But the child's cry, reported by Syoma, had infected him too. The phantom faces he used to erase before firing now had a soundtrack. He saw not just the half-track, but the men inside it. Young, scared, maybe with pictures of their own in their pockets. His finger trembled on the firing pedal. The word "steal" died on his lips. He couldn't summon it. He fired. The shot was rushed, uncalibrated. The massive shell screamed over the low wall, detonating against the brick facade of a building 20 meters behind the half-track. A spectacular, useless eruption of smoke and debris. He had wasted a precious, high-explosive round. A groan, part frustration, part despair, escaped Dead's lips as he moved to load the next shell, his movements now heavy with the weight of impending futility. The half-track, emboldened, intensified its fire. A 20-millimeter round found the Zveroboy's remaining functional periscope on Kalinin's side, plunging his station into near-total darkness. Another round slammed into the gun mantlet, jamming the elevation mechanism with a sickening grind of tortured metal. The main gun was now frozen, fixed at a slightly elevated angle. Useless against the Ferdinand creeping closer down the rear alley, or the Panthers that would surely soon press the attack. They were not just blinded, they were disarmed. The Ferdinand chose that moment to speak again. Its third shot was a masterpiece of malice. It did not aim for the hull. It aimed for the overhang of the building above and to the right of the Zveroboy's position. The 80mm shell sheared through a load-bearing column of brick and timber. With a slow, groaning roar that drowned out all other battle sounds, a large section of the warehouse's upper floor collapsed. Not onto the Zveroboy, but directly into the alley on its right flank, the side where Syoma had reported the not German shadows. A tidal wave of brick, wood, and plaster crashed down, sealing that alley completely under a mountain of rubble. And from within that avalanche of destruction, a new sound emerged. Not German. A chorus of screams, suddenly cut short. Then piteous, weak cries for help in Russian. The shadows had been men. Soviet infantrymen, cut off, hiding, perhaps trying to work their way toward the sound of the Soviet gun. Their refuge had become their mass grave, buried by a German shell intended to crush the Zveroboy. The irony was so dark it was paralyzing. Syoma let out a low, broken wail. His omens had been right, and their ignorance had doomed their own. His hand clenched around the black sea stone, knuckles white. Then the light in his eyes, which had burned with prophetic intensity, began to dim. The last of his strength was spent. His head lolled forward, his breathing becoming a shallow, irregular rattle. The keeper of the house was leaving. Kalinin stared into the darkness of his dead periscope. The map in his mind was now a chart of pure catastrophe. Gun jammed. Vision gone. Allies buried. Escape routes sealed. Rear threat approaching. And the child was still crying, a thread of innocent life in the tapestry of death they had woven. He made a decision, not a tactical decision, a human one, the last he would ever make. "Abandon the gun," he said, his voice hollow but clear. "Dead? Vanya, take the charges, the demolition charges. We'll blow the breach. Then we go to the warehouse. We clear that cellar. We give them a chance." Dead stopped, a shell half lifted. He looked at his commander, as if he had gone mad. Abandon the Zveroboy, their fortress, their purpose, their identity. But he saw the truth in Kalinin's shadowed face. They were no longer a fighting unit. They were a liability inside a metal coffin. The only weapon left was their bodies, and the few grenades and explosive blocks they carried. Vanya didn't argue. The failure of his shot had broken the last of his gunner's spirit. The jammed gun was a physical manifestation of his own paralysis. He nodded numbly. As Dead began rigging the small, shaped demolition charge to the gun's breech to destroy it, Kalinin turned to Syoma. He placed a hand on his driver's good shoulder. There was no time for sentiment, no words that could matter. He simply took his sidearm from its holster and pressed it into Syoma's cold, limp hand, folding his fingers around the grip. A choice, not an order, a gift of final agency. Syoma's eyes fluttered open for a last moment. He didn't look at Kalinin. He looked past him, at the burning wires, at the corpse of his machine. He gave the faintest nod. He understood. He would be the keeper of the house until the end. Kalinin, Vanya, and Dead grabbed their submachine guns, stuffed their pockets with grenades and spare magazines. They were shedding their skins as tankers, becoming infantrymen in a last, desperate infantry fight. Above, in the warehouse, Ark had found the cellar door, a heavy, splintered thing under a collapsed stairwell. He could hear the crying clearly now, mixed with the frantic whispers of adults. He threw his shoulder against it, but it was blocked from the inside. He was about to call out when the world shook with a new, closer explosion. Not from the Ferdinand, not from a Panther. From below, the Zveroboy. A desperate, final, foolish act from the wounded Panthers or the encroaching infantry. A satchel charge thrown by a brave or fanatical German soldier who had crawled through the rubble had been detonated under the Zveroboy's exposed underbelly. The effect was catastrophic. The explosion tore through the thin floor armor. A flash of fire and shrapnel erupted upwards through the fighting compartment. Dead, standing by the breach, setting the charge, took the full force. He was lifted off his feet and slammed against the ammunition racks, his body a broken thing, his cynical, practical wisdom extinguished in a microsecond. Kalinin and Vanya were thrown against the rear hatch, saved by Dead's body and the bulk of the gun itself, but stunned, ears bleeding. In the driver's seat, Semyon Glukov felt the heat wash over him. He opened his eyes. He saw the fire. He saw Dead's body. He saw the pistol in his hand. He looked at the smooth black stone from the Black Sea, now glowing with reflected flame. He smiled a small, pained smile. He raised the pistol, not to his own temple, but to the red-painted primer of a 152mm high-explosive shell in the rack beside him. The shell whose mate he had watched dead load just minutes before. Outside, the Ferdinand edged closer for the killing shot. The German infantry began their final advance, seeing the Zveroboy mortally wounded. And inside the steel coffin, now a true furnace, Semyon Glukov, the superstitious driver who talked to machines, fulfilled his final purpose. He didn't fire at the primer. That would be too fast. Instead, he fired into the burning pool of engine fuel and hydraulic fluid, now spreading across the floor beneath the shell rack. He spoke his last words to his machine, lost in the growing roar of the fire. "For you, my beauty, a clean death, not for them to pick apart." The flame followed the trail of liquid. It reached the base of the ammunition rack. The world did not go white. It went black, then an all-consuming, absolute, and final gold. The explosion was not a single event. It was a layered apocalypse. The first layer was sound, a deep, fundamental thump that compressed the air in the courtyard, a physical blow that shattered every remaining window for 100 meters and slammed Arkady Novikov against the cellar door, knocking the breath from his lungs. It was the sound of the demolition charge on the breach cooking off, a contained fury. The second layer was light, a searing magnesium-bright flash that erupted from every vision slit, hatch, and crack of the Zveroboy, painting the snowy yard in a stark, hellish negative. It bleached the color from the world for a fleeting second. The third and final layer was the detonation of the ammunition rack. This was not an explosion. It was a dissolution. The 46-ton assault gun ceased to be a vehicle. The massive 152mm shells, their casings heated to criticality by the fire, erupted in a chain reaction of primordial force. The Zveroboy did not blow up. It unmade itself. The armored hull, stout enough to deflect cannon fire, was no match for the violence within. It bulged grotesquely at its seams, then tore apart like paper in a hurricane. The turret, weighing tons, was sheared from its ring and hurled upwards in a lazy parabolic arc, spinning against the gray sky before crashing down through the roof of a nearby building with an earth-shaking crash. Chunks of armor plate, red-hot and jagged, scythed through the air like shrapnel from a celestial grenade. The gun barrel, twisted and blackened, was flung onto the cobblestones of the crossroads, landing with a final, mournful clang. A fireball, oily and black at its core, roiled upward, swallowing the alley, licking the walls of the surrounding buildings. It was followed by a rolling wave of superheated air and debris that scoured the courtyard clean, extinguishing the smaller fires only to replace them with a single, towering inferno. The shock wave hit the Ferdinand, still edging down the rear alley. It rocked the 70-ton tank destroyer on its suspension, blinding its crew with dust and splinters, cracking its optics. The commander, momentarily terrified that a Soviet artillery barrage had found them, gave the order to reverse. The immediate, cataclysmic threat from the crossroads had seemingly been annihilated from within. The hunter, satisfied the prey was dead, began to withdraw, its mission to clear the path now seemingly accomplished. The German infantry, advancing in cautious rushes, were caught in the open. The hail of secondary shrapnel, nuts, bolts, track links, pieces of equipment turned into projectiles, cut through them like a scythe. Those not killed outright were thrown to the ground, stunned, eardrums bleeding, their coordinated assault shattered by the sheer, brutal spectacle of the self-immolation. In the warehouse, the world became a shaking, roaring chaos. The wall facing the courtyard bulged inward, and a storm of dust, smoke, and splinters blasted through the interior. Arc, curled against the cellar door, was covered in plaster and debris. When the roaring subsided, replaced by a strange, ringing silence and the crackle of spreading fire, he raised his head. The view from the shattered window was gone, replaced by a wall of smoke and flame. The Zveroboy was gone. In its place was a crater, a twisted skeleton of blackened metal, and a pyre that cast dancing, monstrous shadows on the surrounding ruins. His crew, the metal womb, the angry, cynical, brave men inside it, all vaporized, atomized, transformed into the components of this final, defiant conflagration. He felt nothing. The horror was too total for emotion. He was a void. Then the sound returned. Not the battle. The battle for a moment had stopped, shocked into silence by the suicide of the beast. It was the crying. From behind the cellar door. Weaker now, terrified by the cataclysm overhead, but persistent. A thread of life. He turned back to the door, his soldier's instincts completely erased. He was just a pair of hands now. He scrabbled at the debris blocking it, heaving aside fallen beams with a strength born of adrenaline and emptiness. He found a crack and called out, not in Russian, not in German, but in the universal, simple tongue of desperation. "Hello, coming, I am coming." He heard a shift, a muffled response. He redoubled his efforts. Outside, the world began to reassess. The lead Panther, its commander peering through the smoke, saw the crossroads was now blocked by an impassable burning wreck and a crater. The Zveroboy had achieved its tactical goal in death, more completely than in life. The route was sealed. With the Ferdinand falling back and the infantry mauled, the momentum of the flanking attack was broken. The order crackled over German radio, disengage, find another route. The cost was too high, the delay too great. The metallic growl of the surviving Panthers shifted in tone, from aggressive advance to grudging withdrawal. They began to back away, melting back into the smoky maze of the town. The crossroads, for now, belonged to the dead. Ark finally cleared the cellar door and wrenched it open. A rush of cold, damp air, smelling of earth and fear, wafted out. In the gloom, he saw faces. An old German man with a gaunt, dignified face, holding a kerosene lamp. A woman, perhaps his daughter, clutching two small children to her skirts, their eyes enormous with terror. A teenage boy with a defiant, angry glare, holding a kitchen knife. They were the shadows Sioma had sensed, the human cost buried in the geometry. They stared at the Soviet soldier covered in blood, dust, and soot, his uniform torn, his eyes hollow. He stared back. No words passed between them. Words were for the world that had just ended outside. He simply stepped back from the doorway and gestured with his head. A tired, universal motion. Come out. It's over. They hesitated, distrustful. Then the younger child, a girl, began to cry again, the sound piercing the tense silence. The woman moved, shushing her, and the group began to emerge, blinking in the dim, smoky light of the shattered warehouse, flinching at the sight of the inferno through the gaps in the walls. Ark led them, not with authority, but with the numb certainty of the last man standing. He avoided the front, where German infantry might still lurk, and took them through the back of the warehouse, through a hole in the wall into a maze of backyards and frozen gardens, moving away from the crossroads, away from the burning tomb of the Zveroboy. He walked with them in silence for 10 minutes, until the sound of the fire was distant and the only engines they heard were fading to the north. He stopped at the edge of a shattered park. He looked at the family, then pointed east, toward where the Soviet lines would be, where the distant rumble of the main front now sounded like a promise of salvation or further damnation. The old man met his gaze. There was no gratitude, no hatred. There was only the shared, exhausted understanding of survivors of a shipwreck. The old man gave a single slow nod. The woman herded the children forward. They moved away, spectral figures in the twilight, swallowed by the ruins. Ark did not watch them go. He turned and looked back the way they had come. A column of thick, black smoke rose into the evening sky, a permanent marker for the crossroads. He felt in his pocket. His fingers brushed against the empty space where his university photo had been. It was gone, lost in the warehouse, buried with everything else. He found instead a single spent brass cartridge case from his PPSH, still warm. He stood there for a long time, as the sky darkened from gray to indigo. The distant artillery flashes lit the horizon like silent lightning. The battle had moved on, flowing around the obstacle that had been the Zveroboy and its crew. He was alone, not a hero, not a soldier, a witness. The only keeper of the story of the metal beast that had died as it lived, with a furious, earth-shattering roar, buying with its obliteration a few 100 meters of worthless ground, a few hours of time, and the fragile, silent lives of a handful of strangers. He finally turned his back on the smoke and began to walk, not toward the Soviet lines, not toward anything. Just away from the crossroads, carrying the ringing silence and the smell of burned steel and spent powder deep within him. A living memorial to the fury of the East.